Dr. Felix Hartwell adjusted the holographic display for the third time in 10 minutes, watching ancient Zephyrian characters float in the air like crystallized music. The linguistics lab aboard the orbital research station Aurora hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced translation algorithms, but Felix found himself unable to concentrate on anything except the woman working beside him. Velthora moved through the floating text with an elegance that made Felix think of dancers he'd seen in zero-gravity performances, except she was simply reaching for linguistic constructs that existed only as light and mathematics. Her ears, those distinctive pointed features that marked her as Zephyrian, shifted from pale silver to soft gold as she encountered particularly intriguing passages in the ancient texts. "This concept here," she said, her voice carrying those musical undertones that made human vocal cords seem clumsy by comparison, translates roughly to beauty that exists in the spaces between understanding. Your human languages lack adequate terminology for such abstractions. Felix pulled his attention back to the translation matrix, trying to ignore how the lab's ambient lighting seemed to gather around Velthora like she was some kind of linguistic goddess. We tend to be more concrete in our aesthetic descriptions. Beautiful, pretty, attractive, we don't really have words for beauty that exists in conceptual spaces. Perhaps this is why human art often focuses on physical representation rather than harmonic resonance, Velthora mused, manipulating the holographic text with graceful gestures. You seek to capture what can be seen rather than what can be felt through mathematical harmony. Not all of us are mathematically inclined enough to find equations beautiful, Felix replied, then immediately regretted the comment. I mean, I'm sure your mathematical art is lovely. I just don't have the background to appreciate it properly. Velthora's ears shifted toward him, a movement Felix had learned indicated curiosity. You dismiss mathematical beauty, yet you work with linguistic structures that are themselves mathematical in nature. Grammar, syntax, semantic relationships. These are all expressions of pattern and harmony. When you put it that way, I suppose even human language has its own kind of mathematics. Felix adjusted another display, bringing up comparative syntax charts. Though I doubt our grammar creates the same kind of aesthetic experience as Zephyrian harmonic poetry. Your language creates different harmonics. Chaotic ones, but chaos has its own appeal. Velthora paused in her work, her ears shifting to a color Felix hadn't seen before. Deeper gold with hints of something that might have been warmth. I have been studying human emotional expressions in your literature. The concept of laughter particularly fascinates me. Felix blinked. Laughter fascinates you? Zephyrians do not laugh. We express appreciation through harmonic resonance, but the physical manifestation of humor that humans display, the involuntary vocalization, the facial contortions, it seems both inefficient and strangely compelling. Inefficient is probably accurate, Felix said, grinning despite himself. But sometimes the best things in life are inefficient. Laughter, art, falling in love, none of it makes logical sense, but that's kind of the point. Falling in love, Velthora repeated, her ears shifting again. Another chaotic human emotion that defies mathematical prediction. Completely unpredictable and absolutely terrifying, Felix agreed. Which is probably why poets spend so much time trying to explain it and scientists spend so much time trying to quantify it. And have either succeeded? Not even close. Love remains stubbornly unscientific. Felix caught himself staring at the way the holographic light played across Velthora's features and forced his attention back to the translation matrix. Which drives researchers crazy and keeps artists in business. Velthora made a sound that might have been the Zephyrian equivalent of laughter, though it sounded more like music than the harsh bark of human humor. Chaos as a creative force. Your species approaches existence from such an unusual perspective. Unusual probably describes us pretty well, Felix said. We're not exactly known for our logical consistency. Logic is overrated, Velthora said, then paused as if surprised by her own words. That is, not a typically Zephyrian sentiment. Maybe spending time around humans is corrupting your natural harmony, Felix suggested, then immediately worried he'd crossed some kind of cultural line. I mean, if that's possible. I don't really understand how Zephyrian emotional regulation works. It works through careful balance and harmonic resonance, Velthara said, but her voice carried a note that suggested the topic might be more complicated than the explanation. We maintain equilibrium to prevent the kind of emotional volatility that leads to social discord. Sounds peaceful. Peaceful, yes. Also predictable. She manipulated the holographic display with movements that seemed more agitated than her usual fluid grace. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to experience the kind of emotional intensity your literature describes. Felix looked at her sharply. You've never experienced intense emotions? Intensity disrupts harmony. We are trained from childhood to recognize and regulate emotional spikes before they can create discord. Velthara's ears had shifted to a color Felix couldn't identify, somewhere between the silver of concentration and the gold of curiosity. But recently, I have been experiencing what I can only describe as harmonic irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Moments when my emotional resonance becomes unpredictable. Usually during our work sessions. She turned to look at him directly, and Felix felt something shift in the air between them. I suspect prolonged exposure to human emotional patterns may be affecting my natural regulation. Felix's mouth went dry. Is that a problem? According to Zephyrian medical science, yes. Emotional irregularity can lead to social maladjustment and personal distress. Velthara's expression was difficult to read, but her ears remained that unidentifiable color. According to my personal experience, the irregularities are not entirely unpleasant. Before Felix could figure out how to respond to that admission, the lab's communication system chimed with an incoming message. Velthara moved to answer it, her graceful motion breaking the charged moment between them. Quindar wishes to speak with me about my progress reports, she said after closing the communication. Apparently, my recent work shows signs of what he terms cultural contamination. Cultural contamination. Excessive influence from human thought patterns. He is concerned that my immersion in your language and literature is affecting my ability to maintain proper Zephyrian perspective. Velthara's ears flattened slightly against her head. He is not incorrect in his assessment. Felix felt something cold settle in his stomach. What does that mean for the project? It means I may need to undergo harmonic recalibration to restore proper emotional balance. Velthara's voice remained steady, but Felix caught an undertone that suggested she was less calm than she appeared. Standard procedure for preventing cultural contamination. And if you refuse recalibration? Refusal would indicate that the contamination has progressed beyond correctable parameters. She began shutting down the holographic displays with efficient movements. I should go. Quindar does not appreciate being kept waiting. Felix watched her prepare to leave, trying to process the implications of what she just told him. Velthara, the emotional irregularities you mentioned, do you want them to be corrected? She paused at the lab's exit, her hand resting on the door control. For a moment, her ears shifted through several colors rapidly, as if her emotional regulation was struggling to maintain equilibrium. Want is a dangerous concept for my people, Dr. Hartwell. We prefer to focus on what is optimal rather than what is desired. She looked back at him, and Felix saw something in her expression that made his pulse quicken. But to answer your question, no, I do not wish to lose the capacity for harmonic irregularity. Even if maintaining it proves problematic. After she left, Felix stood alone in the linguistics lab, surrounded by the fading glow of holographic texts and the sudden realization that first contact had become significantly more personal than any diplomatic protocol had anticipated. He looked at the translation matrix they'd been working on, with its exploration of beauty that existed in spaces between understanding, and wondered if he was about to discover exactly what that concept meant. The ancient Zephyrian poetry they'd been translating seemed to pulse with new meaning in the empty lab, its mathematical harmony suggesting possibilities that Felix's orderly academic life had never prepared him to contemplate. 3 days of careful professional distance had done absolutely nothing to resolve Felix's growing problem, which was that working with Velthera had become an exercise in advanced self-torture. Every shared glance over translation matrices, every moment when her musical laughter filled the linguistics lab, every casual brush of her fingers against his when they reached for the same holographic control, it all added up to a level of emotional chaos that Felix was pretty sure violated several principles of effective workplace dynamics. The syntax structure here suggests multiple layers of meaning, Velthera was saying, manipulating a three-dimensional representation of ancient Zephyrian grammar that looked like crystallized poetry. What your human languages express through metaphor, we embed directly into grammatical construction. Felix forced himself to focus on the linguistic analysis rather than the way the holographic light made Velthera's skin seem to glow from within. So the grammar itself carries emotional content. Grammar, mathematics, music, they are all expressions of the same fundamental harmonies. Velthera gestured toward a particularly complex grammatical structure that twisted through the air like a DNA helix made of language. This passage, for example, contains not just information about historical events but also the emotional resonance those events created in Zephyrian society. That's incredibly sophisticated, Felix said, leaning closer to examine the structure. Human languages keep meaning and emotion in separate channels. We use tone, context, subtext, but the grammar itself stays neutral. Neutral grammar seems inefficient. Why separate meaning from the emotional reality of experience? Velthera's ears shifted to that warm gold color that Felix had come to associate with her genuine curiosity about human culture. Your literature suggests that humans place great value on emotional authenticity. We do, but we're also terrified of it, Felix admitted. We spend a lot of energy trying to hide our real feelings behind socially acceptable expressions. Why? Because authentic emotions are messy, unpredictable, and potentially embarrassing. Felix adjusted the holographic display, trying to ignore how Velthera's proximity was affecting his concentration. It's safer to keep feelings private until you're sure they're reciprocated. Reciprocated, Velthera repeated, her ears shifting to a color Felix hadn't seen before, deeper gold with hints of something that might have been silver. You mean, until you know that another person shares your emotional state? Exactly. Otherwise you risk rejection, awkwardness, or worse. Felix caught himself watching the play of colors across her ears and forced his attention back to the translation work. Human courtship is basically an elaborate dance of emotional concealment until someone gets brave enough to reveal their true feelings. How do you determine optimal timing for such revelations? You don't. That's the terrifying part. Felix grinned at her expression of puzzlement. Most human relationships begin with someone taking a completely illogical leap of faith. Faith in what? Faith that the other person might be crazy enough to share your particular form of temporary insanity. Velthera's ears shifted through several colors rapidly, and she made that musical sound that might have been laughter. Your species treats emotional attachment as a form of pleasant madness. Pleasant madness is actually a pretty accurate description of falling in love, Felix agreed. Complete loss of rational thought, accompanied by the best feeling in the universe. And if the madness is not reciprocated? Then you get your heart broken and write terrible poetry until you recover enough to risk it again with someone else. This system seems remarkably inefficient. Catastrophically inefficient, Felix confirmed. Which is probably why it's so addictive. Humans are attracted to experiences that make no logical sense. Velthera manipulated the holographic grammar structure, her movements more thoughtful than usual. Zephyrian bonding is based on harmonic compatibility assessment. Partners are selected through mathematical analysis of emotional resonance patterns. Very efficient, very predictable. Sounds romantic, Felix said, then immediately regretted the sarcasm. Romance is not a factor in Zephyrian partnerships. Stable harmonic resonance creates lasting bonds that serve both individuals and society. Velthera's voice carried no inflection, but her ears had shifted to a color that looked almost gray. It is a superior system to human emotional chaos. Superior in terms of stability, maybe. But what about passion? Discovery? The joy of finding someone who surprises you. Surprises create harmonic disruption. Sometimes disruption is good, Felix said carefully. Sometimes stable systems need to be shaken up to grow into something better. Velthera turned to look at him directly, and Felix felt that familiar shift in the air between them. Are you suggesting that chaos might be preferable to harmony? I'm suggesting that maybe the best harmony comes from integrating chaos rather than eliminating it. Felix met her gaze, noting how her ears had shifted to deep silver with flecks of gold. Like music, it's not the perfect notes that make a song beautiful, it's the way different notes interact to create something neither could achieve alone. That is. Velthera paused, her ears cycling through colors Felix was beginning to recognize as signs of internal conflict. Not a typically Zephyrian perspective. Maybe that's because you've been spending too much time around humans, Felix suggested. We're notoriously bad influences on anyone trying to maintain perfect harmony. Quindar would agree with that assessment. Velthera's expression became carefully neutral. He has expressed concern about my recent behavioral patterns. What kind of behavioral patterns? Emotional irregularities. Questioning of traditional harmonic principles. And. She hesitated, her ears flattening slightly. Excessive interest in human cultural expressions. Felix felt that cold sensation in his stomach again. Excessive by whose standards? By the standards of someone who has known me since childhood and recognizes that my current behavioral patterns are inconsistent with my natural harmonic signature. Velthera began organizing the holographic displays with movements that were too precise, too controlled. He is not wrong. I have been experiencing thoughts and feelings that do not align with Zephyrian emotional regulation. What kind of thoughts and feelings? Velthera's hand stilled on the display controls. Curiosity about experiences that Zephyrian culture considers disruptive. Wonder about what it might feel like to embrace emotional chaos rather than regulate it. And. She turned to face him again, her ears shifting to colors that seemed to change too quickly for Felix to identify. Attraction to someone whose presence creates harmonic irregularities rather than harmonic stability. The linguistics lab seemed to hold its breath around them. Felix felt his pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with advanced alien technology and everything to do with the way Velthera was looking at him. Attraction, he repeated carefully. According to Zephyrian psychological principles, attraction should be based on harmonic compatibility. Partners whose emotional frequencies complement each other create stable resonance patterns. Velthera's voice remained steady, but Felix could hear undertones that suggested she was struggling to maintain her composure. Your emotional signature creates nothing but chaos in my harmonic patterns. Is that a problem? It should be. Chaos leads to instability, poor decision-making, and social discord. Velthera stepped closer to him, close enough that Felix could see the faint luminescence that seemed to flow beneath her skin. But I find myself drawn to the experience of harmonic disruption when you are present. Felix swallowed hard. Velthera, are you saying that you're attracted to me? I am saying that your presence affects my emotional regulation in ways that defy Zephyrian understanding of optimal psychological function. Her ears shifted to deep gold with silver flecks. And that I find these effects pleasant, despite their potential consequences. Before Felix could figure out how to respond to that admission, the lab's door chimed with an incoming visitor. Velthera stepped back quickly, her professional mask sliding into place as Quindar entered the linguistics lab. The older Zephyrian moved with the kind of measured grace that spoke of centuries of perfect emotional regulation. His ears remained steady silver, and his expression carried the neutral pleasantness that Felix was beginning to associate with Zephyrian social interactions. Velthera, Quindar said, his voice carrying harmonic undertones that made the lab's equipment resonate faintly. I trust your research progresses satisfactorily. The translation work proceeds within acceptable parameters, Velthara replied, her own voice returning to its normal musical neutrality. Dr. Hartwell's insights into human linguistic structure have proven valuable for understanding comparative syntax systems. Quindar's attention turned to Felix, and Felix felt like he was being analyzed by a very sophisticated scanner. Dr. Hartwell. Your collaboration with Velthara has been intensive. Linguistic analysis requires detailed cooperation, Felix said, trying to match Velthara's professional tone. Cross-species translation isn't something either of us could accomplish alone. Indeed. However, I have noticed irregularities in Velthara's recent reports that suggest her analytical objectivity may be compromised. Quindar's ears remained perfectly still, but his words carried implications that made Felix's stomach clench. Extended exposure to human emotional patterns can create harmonic contamination that affects judgment. My judgment remains within acceptable parameters, Velthara said, but Felix caught a slight edge in her voice. Acceptable, perhaps. Optimal, no. Quindar moved closer to the holographic displays, examining their work with apparent interest. Your recent analyses show evidence of what I can only describe as emotional interpretation rather than objective assessment. Emotion is relevant to linguistic analysis when studying cultures that integrate feeling into communication, Velthara replied. Human languages cannot be properly understood without considering emotional context. Emotional context can be studied without emotional participation, Quindar corrected gently. The distinction is crucial for maintaining analytical objectivity. Felix felt like he was watching a philosophical duel conducted entirely through subtext and harmonic undertones. Perhaps emotional participation provides insights that pure objectivity can't achieve, he suggested. Quindar's attention focused on him with laser-like intensity. An interesting theory, Dr. Hartwell. Are you suggesting that scholarly objectivity is enhanced by personal emotional investment? I'm suggesting that some aspects of culture can only be understood from the inside, Felix replied. Pure observation has limitations when studying experiential phenomena. Experiential phenomena, Quindar repeated. Such as attraction, perhaps. The question landed in the linguistics lab like a precisely aimed weapon. Felix felt heat rise in his cheeks while Velthara's ears shifted through colors that definitely indicated distress. Academic collaboration often involves intellectual attraction to ideas and methodologies, Felix said carefully. It's a normal part of scholarly partnership. Indeed. However, when intellectual attraction evolves into personal attachment, the quality of academic work inevitably suffers. Quindar's voice remained perfectly reasonable, which somehow made his words more unsettling. Velthara, I believe it would be beneficial for you to undergo harmonic recalibration before continuing this research. Recalibration is unnecessary, Velthara said, her voice carrying harmonics that Felix had never heard before. My work quality remains within established standards. Your work quality is adequate. Your emotional stability is not. Quindar gestured toward the holographic displays. These translations show clear evidence of subjective interpretation influenced by personal feelings rather than objective analysis. Felix looked at the floating grammar structures they'd been analyzing, trying to see what Quindar was seeing. To him, they looked like breakthrough research into cross-species communication. Apparently, to a traditional Zephyrian scholar, they looked like evidence of compromised scientific judgment. Perhaps, Velthara said quietly, some research requires compromised objectivity to achieve meaningful results. Quindar's ears shifted for the first time since entering the lab, moving to a position that Felix suspected indicated surprise. Velthara, that statement suggests that your emotional regulation has been more severely affected than I initially assessed. My emotional regulation is functioning exactly as it should, Velthara replied. The question is whether optimal regulation serves optimal research when studying phenomena that cannot be quantified through traditional methods. Felix realized he was watching something unprecedented, a Zephyrian challenging the fundamental assumptions of her own culture's approach to knowledge and emotional control. The fact that she was doing it because of their collaboration made him feel simultaneously honored and terrified. Quindar moved toward the lab's exit, his expression returning to neutral pleasantness. Velthora, I will arrange for your recalibration session tomorrow. Dr. Hartwell, perhaps it would be beneficial for you to explore other aspects of the cultural exchange program while Velthora undergoes treatment. After he left, the linguistics lab felt charged with the kind of energy that preceded either breakthroughs or disasters. Velthora stood among the holographic displays, her ears cycling through colors that Felix was beginning to recognize as the visual equivalent of emotional chaos. Velthora, Felix said carefully, what exactly happens during harmonic recalibration? Neural frequency adjustment to restore optimal emotional balance, she replied, her voice steady but her ears betraying her distress. Essentially, they will eliminate my capacity for the kind of emotional responses that human interaction has generated. Felix felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. They're going to change who you are. They are going to restore who I am supposed to be according to Zephyrian social standards. Velthora turned to face him, and Felix saw something vulnerable in her expression that made his heart race. The question is whether I want to be restored or whether I prefer the chaos you have introduced into my harmonic patterns. Felix stared at her, realizing that their academic collaboration had evolved into something that could fundamentally alter both their lives. What do you want, Velthora? Her ears shifted to deep gold with silver flecks, and for the first time since he'd known her, her smile was purely human in its emotional complexity. I want to find out what happens when harmonic disruption becomes a choice rather than an accident. The linguistics lab felt different at night, with only emergency lighting casting shadows between the holographic displays that Felix and Velthora had left suspended in the air. Felix couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the harmonic recalibration scheduled for the next morning, couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to lose something precious before he'd fully understood what it was. He found Velthora exactly where he'd expected, standing among the floating translation matrices, her silhouette outlined by the soft glow of ancient Zephyrian poetry that hung in the air like crystallized music. Her ears were shifting through colors he'd never seen before, deep purples and blues that suggested emotional states human vocabulary couldn't adequately describe. Couldn't sleep either? Felix asked, stepping into the lab's ambient lighting. Zephyrians require less rest than humans, Velthora replied without turning around. Though I suspect my current inability to achieve meditative state has more to do with tomorrow's recalibration than with species-specific sleep patterns. Felix moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel the subtle warmth that seemed to radiate from her skin. Are you afraid? Fear is an inefficient emotional response that serves no productive purpose in this situation. Velthora's voice carried its usual musical precision, but Felix caught undertones that suggested she was struggling to maintain her composure. However, I am experiencing what might be described as reluctance to undergo neural modification. Reluctance to lose yourself, you mean? To lose the version of myself that has emerged through our collaboration. She finally turned to face him, her ears shifting to that deep gold that Felix had come to associate with her most honest moments. The version that finds chaos stimulating rather than disturbing. Felix studied her face in the holographic light, noting the way her features seemed to carry both alien elegance and something that felt achingly familiar. Velthora, what if you refused the recalibration? Refusal would indicate that my emotional contamination has progressed beyond correctable parameters. I would be classified as psychologically unstable and removed from active research duties. Her expression remained controlled, but her ears betrayed her distress. Essentially, I would become a cautionary example of what happens when Zephyrians allow human emotional chaos to disrupt their natural harmony. That seems like a high price to pay for having feelings. Feelings are dangerous for my people, Felix. We have built our entire civilization on the principle of harmonic balance. Individual emotional expression that disrupts social harmony is considered a form of madness. Velthora moved closer to one of the translation displays, her fingers dancing through holographic text that responded to her touch like living language. But recently, I have begun to wonder whether madness might be preferable to eternal stability. Felix felt his pulse quicken at the way she'd used his first name, dropping the formal titles they'd maintained throughout their professional collaboration. What kind of madness? The madness of wanting things that make no logical sense. Of finding beauty in chaos rather than in mathematical perfection. Of experiencing emotional responses that serve no productive function but feel more real than anything I have ever known. Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. The madness of caring more about one human's opinion than about the approval of my entire civilization. The words hung in the air between them like a confession that changed everything. Felix realized he was holding his breath, afraid that speaking might shatter whatever fragile moment they'd created in the empty linguistics lab. Velthera, he said finally, his voice rougher than he'd intended, are you saying that I am saying that tomorrow's recalibration will eliminate my capacity for the kind of emotional chaos that makes me want to understand what human love feels like. She turned to face him fully, and Felix saw something in her expression that made his heart race. And I am saying that I would rather experience that chaos for one night than spend centuries wondering what I might have missed. Felix stared at her, trying to process the implications of what she was suggesting. Velthera, if we acknowledge what has been building between us for weeks. If we stop pretending that professional collaboration can contain the kind of connection we have discovered. Her ears shifted to colors that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. What then, Felix? Then everything changes, Felix said quietly. For both of us. Everything is already changing. Tomorrow's recalibration will ensure that the changes serve Zephyrian social harmony rather than personal growth. Velthera stepped closer to him, close enough that Felix could see the faint luminescence beneath her skin, could feel the subtle warmth that made her presence impossible to ignore. Unless I choose chaos over harmony while I still have the capacity for choice. Felix reached toward her, then stopped, his hand suspended in the space between them. Velthera, are you sure? Once we cross this line, there's no going back to professional distance. Professional distance is a luxury I will lose tomorrow regardless. Her ears shifted to deep gold with silver flecks that seemed to catch the holographic light. At least this way, I choose what I lose and what I gain. Felix closed the distance between them, his hand finally making contact with her face. Her skin felt like warm silk infused with starlight, and when she leaned into his touch, he felt something shift in his understanding of what connection could mean across the vast spaces between different forms of consciousness. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, he whispered, the words escaping before his brain could edit them for diplomatic appropriateness. Velthera's eyes widened, her ears shifting to colors that cycled too quickly for Felix to identify. For a moment, she was perfectly still, and Felix realized with growing horror that his whispered admission had been heard and understood. Then she spun around in his arms, her movement fluid and deliberate, her face tilted up toward his with an expression that combined surprise, joy, and something that looked like the visual equivalent of laughter. Beautiful, she repeated, her voice carrying harmonic overtones that made the words sound like music. According to Zephyrian aesthetic principles, beauty is determined by mathematical harmony and symmetrical proportion. According to those standards, I am adequately formed but not exceptional. According to human aesthetic principles, mathematical harmony is less important than the way someone's presence makes the rest of the universe seem more interesting, Felix replied, his hands moving to frame her face. And by those standards, you're absolutely extraordinary. Extraordinary, Velthera mused, her ears shifting to steady gold. Not mathematically optimal, but somehow more than the sum of my measurable qualities. Exactly. Beautiful in ways that can't be quantified or predicted or regulated through harmonic therapy. Felix felt himself smiling despite the enormity of what they were risking. Beautiful because you're you, not because you conform to any particular standard. Human aesthetics are completely irrational, Velthera observed, but her voice carried warmth that transformed the criticism into something that sounded like appreciation. Completely irrational, Felix agreed. Just like human emotions, human relationships, and human approaches to everything that matters. And you find this irrationality appealing? I find you appealing. The irrationality is just a bonus. Felix leaned closer, close enough to see the way her ears shifted with each subtle change in her emotional state. Velthera, tomorrow they're going to try to take away your capacity for this kind of chaos. Are you going to let them? She was quiet for a long moment, her ears cycling through colors that suggested complex internal processes. When she spoke, her voice carried new harmonics that Felix had never heard before. Chaos has shown me possibilities that harmony never revealed. It has taught me that optimal function is not always optimal experience. Her hands moved to rest against his chest, and Felix felt his heartbeat accelerate in response to her touch. And it has demonstrated that some discoveries are worth abandoning safety to explore. Even if exploring them means leaving everything familiar behind. Especially then. Velthera's smile transformed her face into something that made Felix understand why poets wrote about beauty that transcended description. Besides, you will be exploring unfamiliar territory as well. Humans have no more experience with interspecies relationships than Zephyrians do. Felix laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the linguistics lab. True. We'll both be making it up as we go along. Making it up, Velthera repeated, her ears shifting to colors that suggested delight. Improvisation rather than calculation. Chaos rather than harmony. Completely irrational and absolutely perfect. Completely irrational and absolutely perfect, Felix agreed, leaning down to kiss her. The moment their lips met, Felix felt something resonate between them that had nothing to do with Zephyrian harmonic technology and everything to do with the recognition of matching frequencies that created harmony not through similarity but through perfect complementarity. When they broke apart, both breathing harder than strictly necessary, Velthera's ears were shifting through colors that Felix was pretty sure had never appeared in any Zephyrian emotional regulation manual. That was. She began, then paused, apparently lacking adequate vocabulary. Completely irrational? Felix suggested. Perfect, Velthera finished, her smile bright enough to power the station's navigation systems. Absolutely, chaotically, irrationally perfect. Outside the linguistics lab's viewport, the stars continued their ancient dance through space, indifferent to the small drama playing out between two different forms of consciousness, learning that some kinds of beauty existed in the spaces between understanding, some kinds of harmony emerged from embracing rather than eliminating chaos, and some kinds of love were worth risking everything to explore. The summons came at dawn, delivered through the station's communication system with the kind of formal precision that left no room for interpretation. Velthera was to report immediately for harmonic recalibration, and Felix was requested to attend a diplomatic meeting regarding the cultural exchange program's future. Felix stood in the corridor outside Conference Room 7, trying to prepare himself for what he suspected would be a very uncomfortable conversation about professional boundaries and diplomatic protocols. Through the room's transparent walls, he could see Captain Martinez conferring with what appeared to be the entire Zephyrian delegation, their ears maintaining the kind of steady neutral colors that suggested serious discussion. When he entered the conference room, the conversation stopped with the abruptness of a communications blackout. Felix took his assigned seat, noting that Velthera was conspicuously absent from the gathering. Dr. Hartwell, Captain Martinez began, her voice carrying the diplomatic neutrality that meant she was about to deliver bad news. We need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about the linguistics project. What kind of concerns? Felix asked, though he suspected he already knew. Quindar leaned forward, his ears remaining perfectly still as he spoke. Concerns about the psychological effects of extended human-Zephyrian collaboration. Velthera's recent behavioral patterns suggest that exposure to human emotional volatility has compromised her ability to maintain proper harmonic balance. Her work quality has remained consistently high, Felix pointed out. Whatever personal changes she's experienced haven't affected her professional performance. Professional performance is not the only consideration, another Zephyrian delegate interjected. Social harmony requires individual emotional stability. When one member of our community experiences persistent harmonic disruption, it affects the entire collective. Captain Martinez consulted her tablet, her expression carefully neutral. Dr. Hartwell, there have been reports of personal involvement between you and Velthera that goes beyond professional collaboration. Felix felt heat rise in his cheeks. Our relationship has remained within appropriate boundaries for academic partnership. Academic partnerships do not typically result in the kind of neural frequency changes that Velthera has exhibited, Quindar said, his voice carrying harmonic undertones that sounded almost sad. Her emotional patterns have become increasingly chaotic over the past several weeks. Chaotic, or more complex? Felix asked. There's a difference between dysfunction and growth. Growth that disrupts social harmony is dysfunction by definition, the Zephyrian delegate replied. Individual development must serve collective stability. And if individual development requires exploring experiences that challenge collective assumptions? Felix leaned forward, knowing he was probably about to end his diplomatic career but unable to stop himself. What if your assumptions about optimal emotional regulation are limiting rather than protecting your people? The silence that followed was profound enough that Felix could hear the station's life support systems humming in the background. Several Zephyrian ears shifted to colors that Felix suspected indicated shock, while Captain Martinez looked like she was considering early retirement. Dar. Hartwell, Quindar said finally, are you suggesting that Zephyrian civilization is fundamentally flawed? I'm suggesting that any system that can't adapt to new information will eventually become obsolete, Felix replied. And Velthera has been gathering new information about emotional experience that challenges some of your basic assumptions about optimal function. Emotional chaos is not new information, another delegate said, her ears flattening against her head. It is a well-documented phenomenon that leads to social discord and individual suffering. But what if the chaos isn't random? What if it's the kind of complex system that creates emergent properties you can't achieve through regulation? Felix stood up, knowing he was probably about to be ejected from the meeting but unable to contain his frustration. You're about to modify Velthera's neural patterns to eliminate her capacity for experiences that have made her more creative, more insightful, and more authentically herself than she's ever been. More authentically human, you mean, Quindar corrected gently. The version of Velthera that you find appealing is not her natural state. It is a product of psychological contamination. It's a product of growth, Felix shot back. And growth requires the willingness to become something different from what you started as. Captain Martinez stood up, clearly recognizing that the diplomatic situation was deteriorating rapidly. Perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow everyone to. The conference room's door chimed, and Velthera entered without waiting for permission. Felix felt his breath catch at the sight of her. She was wearing standard Zephyrian formal attire, but her ears were shifting through colors that looked like emotional aurora, and her expression carried a determination that made the air in the room feel charged with possibility. I apologize for the interruption, she said, her voice carrying harmonic undertones that made the room's communication equipment resonate faintly. But I understand that my psychological status is being discussed. Velthera, Quindar said, his ears shifting to what Felix recognized as concern, you should be undergoing recalibration. I have declined recalibration, Velthera announced, her words landing in the conference room like a precision-guided diplomatic missile. I have also submitted my resignation from the Zephyrian Research Collective. The silence that followed was so complete that Felix wondered if the station's artificial gravity had malfunctioned. Several Zephyrian delegates appeared to be experiencing some kind of system overload, their ears cycling through colors that Felix was pretty sure weren't supposed to exist in normal emotional regulation. Velthera, Quindar said slowly, resignation from the collective is not possible without formal psychological assessment and approval. Resignation from the collective is exactly what I am announcing, Velthera replied, moving to stand beside Felix in a gesture that felt like claiming territory. Along with my intention to pursue research opportunities that allow for emotional authenticity rather than regulation. This is unprecedented, another delegate said, her voice carrying harmonic frequencies that suggested distress. Individuals Etherians do not simply abandon their social obligations for personal preferences. Perhaps it is time for some precedents to be established, Velthara said, her ears shifting to steady gold. Dr. Hartwell's research has demonstrated that emotional complexity creates resilience rather than instability. I intend to explore the implications of that discovery. Felix stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Velthara, are you choosing exile from your own people? I am choosing growth over safety, she replied, turning to face him with an expression that made his heart race. I am choosing the opportunity to discover what I might become rather than accepting limitation to what I have always been. This decision is clearly the result of psychological contamination, Quindar said, his voice carrying what might have been pleading. Velthara, you are not thinking clearly. Human emotional influence has compromised your judgment. Human emotional influence has expanded my judgment, Velthara corrected. It has shown me possibilities that Zephyrian culture does not acknowledge and experiences that harmonic regulation prevents. She moved closer to Felix, close enough that he could feel the subtle warmth that seemed to radiate from her skin. Dr. Hartwell, when you whispered that I was beautiful, you were describing something that cannot be quantified through mathematical analysis. You were seeing me in ways that my own people's aesthetic standards cannot accommodate. Felix felt everyone in the conference room watching him, their attention focused with laser-like intensity on his response. I was seeing you as yourself, not as a collection of measurable qualities. Exactly. And being seen that way has taught me that optimal function is not always optimal experience. Velthara's ears shifted to colors that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. I want to continue learning what Felix's chaos can teach me about possibilities that Zephyrian harmony cannot reveal. Captain Martinez cleared her throat diplomatically. Velthara, are you requesting asylum aboard this station? I am requesting the opportunity to continue my research under conditions that allow for emotional authenticity, Velthara replied. Whether that requires asylum depends on my people's willingness to accept unprecedented choices. Quindar stood up, his movement precise and controlled despite what Felix suspected was considerable emotional turmoil. Velthara, if you refuse recalibration and abandon your collective obligations, you will be classified as psychologically unstable. You will not be welcome in Zephyrian space. Then I will explore other spaces, Velthara said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was accepting. With someone who finds beauty in chaos rather than order. She turned to Felix, her expression carrying vulnerability and determination in equal measure. Dr. Hartwell, are you prepared to explore uncharted territory with someone whose presence will create permanent disruption in your life? Felix looked at her, at the woman who had challenged every assumption he'd ever made about beauty, intelligence, and the possibility of connection across the vast spaces between different forms of consciousness. Her ears were shifting through colors that suggested hope, fear, and something that looked like love wearing alien clothing. Velthara, he said, reaching for her hand, I've been ready for that disruption since the first time you laughed at my terrible linguistics jokes. Her fingers interlaced with his, and Felix felt that harmonic resonance that had nothing to do with Zephyrian technology and everything to do with the recognition of complementary frequencies finding perfect synchronization. Then let us discover what happens when two different forms of chaos learn to harmonize, Velthara said, her smile transforming her face into something that made Felix understand why philosophers wrote about beauty that transcended description. Around them, the conference room erupted into diplomatic discussion about precedents, protocols, and the implications of interspecies relationships for cultural exchange programs. But Felix found himself focused on the feel of Velthara's hand in his, on the way her ears shifted to steady gold when she looked at him, and on the sudden realization that first contact had evolved into something that no diplomatic handbook had ever anticipated. Outside the conference room's viewport, the stars continued their ancient dance through space, indifferent to the small drama playing out between two different forms of consciousness who had discovered that some kinds of beauty existed in the spaces between understanding, some kinds of harmony emerged from embracing rather than eliminating chaos, and some kinds of love were worth risking everything to explore. The universe, Felix thought as Velthera's hand squeezed his in gentle reassurance, was much more interesting when you stopped trying to regulate it and started letting it surprise you instead. And sometimes the most beautiful discoveries emerged not from perfect harmony but from the willingness to find new kinds of music in the spaces between different melodies learning to sing together.